Recorded, and I'll hand over to Marion. Hello, Marion.
Hello, Michael. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see everybody. And today we get to welcome an SCM legend, Sandy Yule. Before we do that, wherever we are in the territory that is currently Australia, we acknowledge that we are on unceded, stolen Aboriginal land. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in Sydney, and we're all on different, well, not everybody, Helen's not, but all of us who are in what is currently Australia are on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We are here to hear from Sandy, who's going to talk to us about SCM's challenge to the churches in the 1960s. Sandy is a retired Uniting Church minister. Having said he's a legend, I really don't need to tell you all this, but anyway, I didn't actually know all of it when I looked up his LinkedIn profile and asked him for his story. He was a student member of SCM from 1959 to 1965, and he was then he did theological study at Princeton, and then he was a tutor at the Bosse Ecumenical Institute from 1969 to 70, and his daughter Rebecca was born while they were at Bosse. And he was a General Secretary of ASCM from 1970 to 1975, the last person to hold the title of ASCM General Secretary. And then he spent most of his career as a lecturer in Australia and in Tonga, and he's been the secretary of the Uniting Churches Christian Unity Working Group for 8 years, and he's also the author of 2 books, Making Peace, Making Sense and The Burning Mirror. And having sort of always heard these stories about the golden days of the SCM and then this kind of collapse and crisis that happened to it in the 1960s. I can't wait to hear about what Sandy's going to tell us. So Sandy, what we usually do is have the speaker speak for about half an hour and then over for questions and discussion. Is that right with you?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay, off you go.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne as the traditional custodians of the land, and their elders past, present and emerging. In terms of SCM and the challenge to the churches, the challenge was not from SCM, the challenge was through SCM. And the challenge was of how we failed to maintain the faith as it had been handed down to us. And the reasons for that were complex, and some were good and some were bad, the reasons for failing to maintain the faith. But I think we should concentrate on the good reasons for failing to maintain what was handed down to us, because that's what I do believe pretty much happened in that period. Risto Latonen wrote The Story of a Storm. And to my mind, the storm was not simply an aberration. The storm was really the turn away from the Constantinian era. To my mind, that was central to what happened at the time, that we were no longer able to identify as Australians and as Christian in the same breath. So that needs a bit of unpacking, but I'll start there. So the comfortable beliefs and ways of doing things, institutional behaviour and habits, I think were Constantinian when I first joined the SCM. They assumed a church that was diverse and many forms, but it was very loyal to the nation and didn't see too much reason to do more than try to be good people within that, as it were. the debate was narrow between what was generous politics and what wasn't so generous politics. And we didn't see so much, I think, difference between different Australians. The assumption of Christianity as our identity always meant that we were on the right side of history. The Christian faith was blessed by God. And so every Christian nation thought that even though they fell away a little from time to time, God was on their side and would gently lead them back to the right path. So this was the kind of belief system and that attitude, I think, that was prevalent in the churches, particularly at the time when I was growing up. So if we think of challenges to that, firstly from within, in 1963, there was The Death of God, a book published by John Robinson. And this was one of, I think, quite a number of books at the time that were questioning the validity, the truth of this cozy assumption, Constantinian assumption. But it was doing it more around God rather than around us. And I think that was perhaps a mistake at the time, but anyway. Also the demythologizing of the Bible, that the Bible was being critically examined, and Bultmann's project of demythologizing seemed to lead off into the sands until you realized that it was in fact in favor of a remythologizing in a contemporary language. So these were the kind of things that were happening when I was an undergraduate. I left Australia in 1966 to go and study in Princeton. And at that time, the ASCM still had a national conference of 400 or so people. And by the time I came back in 1970 to take up the position of General Secretary, the national conference had dwindled to 100. So definitely a change, definitely a decline. The other element in here, which is worth talking about, I think, is the WSCF version of this, or contribution to this. At the assembly in 1964 of the WSCF, the third world voices started to be heard. And so there was no longer a secure Western assumption about Constantinian Christianity, but instead there was nervousness, there was challenge, there was contestation. And by 1968, in Finland, it sort of fell apart a bit, but it certainly was a clear challenge to the world from the third world that the Constantinian assumptions needed to be totally revised, and somewhere another foundation needed. The shaking of the foundations was what was happening at the time, because there was no longer agreement or a comfortable acceptance of traditional faith simply to inhabit. So I remember the time as a time of real searching and quite serious theological questioning. When I started working for the ASCM in 1970, I hit upon the method of dialogue and writing a dialogue at the start of the ASCM newsletters, if you remember those old Ronioed newsletters, which very, very graphic presentation, but the first part of each one has a dialogue written by me, trying to tease out different possibilities that were in some form of relation to each other. It was an exploratory method, not a declaratory method. We weren't in a position to declare, that we have the way forward here, but we do have the possibility of finding a way forward if we listen well to each other. That was the kind of subtext of writing dialogues. And what interested me was that I could usually find quite a lot to say on both sides of most issues. And that was quite important at the time, because you needed to find the positive thing that your enemies were saying in order to have a chance of seeing your own blind spots. And I do think that a large part of the work in those years was to become aware of our own blind spots, what we were missing, and that the journey into the other point of view was in fact the critical move. Turning to the WSCF assembly in Addis Ababa, which I attended, that was a really interesting and challenging experience. The assembly was 7 days in Addis Ababa. I was part of the Asian delegation, and they put me up to be part of the sounding committee. Now, the sounding committee had the job of trying to articulate an ideology for the ASCM, for the WSCF. What is our way forward? Where do we stand as WSCF? And couldn't be Constantinian. So we got to our meetings, and the Marxist from Milan brought forward a proposed text, and in this proposed text, he said the WSCF will be anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, and anti-establishment, effectively. And I thought, yes, that's yes. And then the delegate from Africa, this is over 3 or 4 days conversation, but the delegate from Africa said, and anti-racist. Yeah, we need that, yeah. Anti-racist is good. And then the woman delegate from the United States said, and anti-sexist. And at that point, I recovered my sense of comfort, because it seemed to me that nobody was going to be fully on the upside of any of these particular bifurcations. We were going to have everybody listening to everybody else, if that was our basic stance. And that was pretty much what was adopted at the time. And I do believe it's pretty much what's been followed ever since, that it's not that we know what the way forward is in the WSCF, but we do know that we have to listen better to all the voices and support each other to come forward as who we are. Following that, I think one of the really important and interesting things that happened was a recognition that what mattered in international meetings, and particularly international relationships, was solidarity. So we turned to a kind of way of working which said, who's in trouble with their government? Who needs a visit? And the idea of visits to groups that were in some degree of difficulty came on the scene. Now, this is such a different stance and a different way of working. I mean, previously we would pass a resolution, sort of condemning a government for doing something bad, or expressing support and so on. But the sense of solidarity visits is very much a matter of being there to listen, and listen on the ground, not simply from a distance. And I can remember the visit we had to Korea in 1973. Korea was under military dictatorship at the time, and I do remember landing at Seoul Airport and finding all these people with guns standing around. Quite foreign to me. The visit was very carefully prepared, and I had 3 days meeting with people in Japan before we went to Korea, and 3 days afterwards for debriefing. And we met with a very small selection of KSCF people because they didn't want to expose too many people. Anyway, there were 7 KSCF people in jail at the time because of demonstration and various things. And the government was attempting to paint them as pro-North Korea. So that was important for us to at least question and challenge. And eventually they were not actually executed, as some others were who had previously been definitely for North Korea, apparently. But anyway, it was a visit that had positive consequences. But it just seemed to me to be another example of both how little you really know about other people, and how important it is to be there and to meet with people and just take a stance that conversation matters. Those people were in fact let out of jail in the next little while. It was the jail as the kind of warning system they had at the time. So those are some of the experiences. And another example was on the way to Addis Ababa. I had the opportunity to go to South Africa, where there were 3 people under banning orders, and I was given a driver whose name I must admit I don't now remember by day as now day, in the Christian Institute, who took me to visit each of those 3 people. They were allowed to see one person at a time, and so that was not breaking their banning order. But I did make recordings of what they had to say about their situation, which I was able to take out of South Africa and give to African WSCF people. That was another very salutary experience for me. And going back to the assembly, I think I have to say, I was asked at the assembly why there were no Aboriginal people in the Australian delegation. A question that was very hard to answer at the time. And my answer was greeted with, "That's what an oppressor would say." So you can see what I'm getting to, that the experiences of the WSCF interaction was one of recognising how we are seen by others, recognising our place in the world, recognising the injustice of Australian occupation, which had never been at that time even remotely acknowledged by white people, with a few individual honourable exceptions, and has now come to a slow and better place with great patience from Indigenous Australians. Behind all this, I think we should see the emergence of liberation theology, that where you stand in terms of the gospel is with God's purposes in the world. And God's purposes in the world are for liberation. So injustice will always stand against God's purposes. And liberation is, despite all its defects and problems in a liberation movement struggle, always problems, and some injustice in return. Nevertheless, the project of liberation, I came to realise, was indeed of God. That God is there somehow in the struggle for liberation. Now, this was just not there at all in my previous theological understanding, and it's taken a long journey to assimilate it. But I think that the real way to see it is that all the voices in the world need to be heard, and the ones who are suffering the most need to be listened to the most. God has a preferential option for the poor was one of the slogans that supported the Liberation Project, theologically speaking, and the sense that one needed to, so to speak, step outside one's Constantinian privilege in order to be where God is. That you couldn't just expect that God was going to keep blessing where you were at. This was also the time, I think, when women's liberation and gay liberation came to the fore. And it was all part of the same, I would say, privileging of the voice of those who suffer oppression, who suffer from the dominant culture and the dominant people in society who don't give them a proper place and a proper recognition. So that this common pattern is there. the interesting thing to me personally was that I realized that I was on the wrong side of most of these liberation struggles. That my personal identity was male, yes, and straight, yes, Australian, yes, okay, and it seemed to me that what that led to was a sense of being an ally of those seeking liberation, not the main driver of it. But we don't know the answers. We don't know what the justice is until we've heard the story. And once we start listening to the story better, then we start finding out who we need to be friends with. But also what we need to challenge in our own history and our own story, and just stop giving credence to it, and I suppose support. So it ended up with a sense of ongoing dialogue being the take-home message from liberation theology, that God required it of us to listen better. God required it of us to take the journey into the dispossessed, the shoes of the dispossessed. Now, this is possible in the power of the Holy Spirit, but it's not, so to speak, a human recipe, as I came to find out, because who speaks for the poor? Who actually knows the story? Where is truth to be found? Not at all clear. You just need you need that sort of magic moment of Holy Spirit connection in order to hear the truth, both in the broader political struggles and also, I would say, in individual stories. So where that's led me back to personally, and this is the strange thing, it's led me back to prayer and discernment as a central and necessary element in any liberation journey. That it is a matter of traveling with God to liberation, not simply going out and claiming it for ourselves. But you can't tell other people that, but at least we can know that for ourselves. So that's my take on the question we started with, which was, what does the ASCM challenge for the church? I would say the ASCM challenge for the church is this journey, which I believe we've been on ever since, well, forever, but certainly since the 60s. That is the challenge. It's not really rocket science, and it's not really different from that. Just the value and the need for solidarity with those who suffer, and across a very wide front of people and contexts in which this is happening, and holding together in the power of God's love as we do that. So I think that's perhaps enough from me to get the ball rolling. So let me stop there and see where we get to.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Sandy. I have about 50 questions, but I'm sure other people do too, so I will hold back. Ian, what do you want to ask or say?
Well, many things. Thank you, Sandy. That was a lovely talk, and you said so many important things. In 1962, so it's sort of into the period you started with, I was also on the executive of the National Youth Council of Australia and got chosen to be its representative at a conference to be held in Patna in India. It was organized jointly by UNESCO and the World Assembly of Youth. Incidentally, the World Assembly of Youth was the democratic free world organization internationally. There's a similar movement from the communist states at that time. It was a long aeroplane flight, Sandy, to get to the airport, Dum Dum Airport in Calcutta from Melbourne. And just after my plane arrived, a huge Russian jet landed and a crowd of people came out, and I drifted over to see what was going on and asked somebody, there seemed to be some sort of celebrity. And I was taken up the front by somebody in the group and introduced to Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin was brought to India in a great celebration he was the first human being to circumvent the world in a satellite. And he invited me to ride on the bus from Dum Dum Airport into Calcutta. And I was never backward in taking the chance of a chat. He told me a funny story about this, that when he was up in the satellite circling the world, he made a comment on the radio down to the Baikonur space station and said, "I'm up in heaven and there is no sight of God." This apparently was broadcast all over the world. And one of the responses was sent back up to him, which was a response from the Archbishop of Canterbury, which was sent to the Baikonur space station and forwarded to Gagarin. And the Archbishop's message was, "If you can see something, it is not God." Now, I mentioned that story because in a broader sense, it's one of those moments when we were sharply drawn face to face with a fundamental transformation of a different kind entirely. 10 years earlier, a very good historian of science, Alexandre Coudray, had written a book with the title "From a Closed World to an Infinite Universe."
Yes.
And I mean, what I mentioned about Gagarin and that book and what it said is, well, it started to come into the picture from really some, people like Galileo on. It started to make its way, but as a cultural phenomena affecting the world as a whole, it really has in very deep ways profoundly changed the way that we can speak and that the way in which we Christians speak. And this is not just simply the sort of changes that came with John Robinson and Honest to God. This was really even more profound in a way. How, if the world is infinite, if the universe is infinite, how do you speak about creation? I mean, it starts to get very tricky.
I think you're right, Ian. It's got a long history, and this is it is a matter of really understanding what the word God means in a way.
Yes.
Once you start to question our understanding of God, I think you get into this quite quickly and quite well. It's a very open and good way in. Quite challenging as well to do that. But the churches don't easily live with this reality. I think is part of the problem, and I think those of us who see that it's there need to help others to be humble about what we can say as church and what we do know.
It's also difficult a few years later, many years later, back teaching no longer in North America after 20 years, but teaching at Deakin. I won a Templeton course prize with a colleague. Took us to Berkeley in California, and while there we had meetings with the staff of NASA who were running the Mars project at the time. But the more difficult problem came when we met with a woman from the University of Washington, St. Louis, who was one of the directors of the Human Genome Project. And she gave one of the most brilliant addresses I've ever heard, and challenging. And she talked about some of what is made possible in genetic research. And at the end, 3 of us had been selected to go to dinner with her and ask a bit more questions. And at one stage, I said to her, well, in the genetic world that's going on, where is the cutting edge? And she said, oh, I think at the moment, watch the Santa Fe Institute. I said, they're working in genetics. Yes. A year later, I picked up a newspaper report which mentioned that scientists at the Santa Fe Institute had treated a woman who'd had an infection that shredded her bladder, and she'd been treated with stem cell technology and grew a new bladder internally. I wrote to the director of the Human Genome Project on this report coming and thanked her for giving me this information. And I said to her, when are the big organs going to be able to be redone? And she said, oh, 2025. I said, too late. But there is another part, not just the physical universe, as it were, or many universes, but also what it is to be a human being genetically, and what can be done with the treatment of, well, it's already been done, of treating themselves so that they can be put onto scaffolds and rebuild a heart. Again.
We might move on. Thank you
Yes,
so much,
please.
Ian. We have another comment from Roz.
Hello.
Hello, Ross.
Hi, Sandy. It's always lovely to hear your wisdom and your many years of experience. Just a quick question from me. Showing my lack of theological background, I think I've got a bit of an understanding of what Constantinian Christianity is, but would love to hear a little bit more about it if that's possible.
Well, it was the fateful adoption of Christianity as the religion of the empire by Constantine in 300 and whatever that set the pattern for 1700 years. And so it was a very collectivist form of Christianity, not individual at all. Although you still had your monks and individuals who did go looking for something more. But the assumption that Christianity could be, so to speak, domesticated into a national program of some sort and a national way of life was perhaps the downside of that project. And it has fallen apart, I would say, in our time. And so that's the quick answer. Is that enough for us?
Yeah, thanks. And just how has that affected ASCM?
Well, ASCM grew up in the shadow of it because the missionary movement of the late 19th century was very much a matter of Western expansion. The Protestant missionary movement was Western expansionism because the missionaries went along with their own people into what are now called third world countries. So, we were coming bringing the gospel to them. And that also meant that we were coming bringing all sorts of other gifts and technology and hospitals and the rest. And that was seen as such a good thing. And the downside of it was never interrogated, or not enough. So that sense of the superiority of Western culture, I think, infected the value of the Christian presence.
Thanks, Sandy.
Thanks, Roz. Mandy.
Yes, that raises something for me. I remember in the early 80s, Bishop Bob Butters, who was the head of the Anglican Board of Mission, saying that he had faced similar challenges at international conferences on mission.
Yeah.
African people saying, oh, how dare you? And really challenging him on racism, especially, but also on any assumption of superiority, and how it was really a shock to his system. But it's all part of that whole movement of change, which questioned whether everything good came from the West, and started to say, look, Christ is in every culture.
Yes.
Let's, we have to just uncover that and really look much harder at it. So I think those processes were happening in other parts of the churches as well over time. And they might have begun with the 60s, but they continue until today, Sandy, as you were saying.
Indeed. And I mean, it's nothing special to SCM in a way, that we just got there early.
Yes.
Okay, we have questions from both Helen and John, and I'm not sure who beat whom to the hand up, so I'm going to take it left to right on my screen. Helen.
Helen, you're...
Good. Thanks, Marion. Yes, look, there's a couple of things I could say relating to what Sandy said, but just something on the last thing. I was actually outside Australia most of the time you were General Secretary, Sandy. I was in the UK working for the Europe-Africa project of the World Student Christian Federation under an internship from the United Presbyterians of the USA, who had already had a lot of this debate on racism, sexism, and the whole rest of it. But I remember when and I'll just make a comment, World Council of Churches gave grants to the liberation movements of the Portuguese African colonies and the South Africa and Zimbabwe, and also to some groups in Australia, some Aboriginal groups in Australia. And some of the churches were shocked. They were all happy to support, the ANC and ZANU and the, Frelimo, but Australia, could they possibly think that, the groups that were given money in Australia were equivalent of the liberation movements in Africa? And that really frightened people quite a bit, but set up, I think, a very good debate. And of course, as you say, to SCM, it was nothing new, and it was what you would logically do. But the other thing I just wanted to ask you, Sandy, because yesterday and the day before, we've just had in Dili here a centenary celebration of the life of Paulo Freire.
Oh, yes.
And when I arrived back in Australia, the week I arrived back in Australia, all my friends had mysteriously disappeared, and they were all at Frankston attending a secret conference with Paulo Freire.
That's right.
And I said to my father, oh, can you drive me to the YMCA camp? I want to try and get in. And luckily, because I knew Paulo Freire, because he'd been our organiser for the Frontier Internship in Mission Orientation, he said, oh, hello, Helen. So they let me in. But I just wondered from your perspective whether you've got any comments on the impact of Paulo Freire, because it was a very interesting group of organisations that invited him, I believe, to Australia,
yes,
including the World Council of Churches. I'm not sure to what extent SCM was involved, because I wasn't actually here then, but I know a lot of SCMers went.
I was there at that meeting, and Cliff Wright was the church organiser, and a few others. I thought it was a very positive meeting because it started to focus on what can be done. What can we actually work at and do in support of these beautiful but broad ideas? How do you make this work? How do you take action on this? And Paulo Freire was a good guide in that, I thought, a very good guide. I remember him saying, that you don't get change in society until you get the radicals and the moderates kind of heading in the same direction. And that's where we are right now. It's once again, we're starting to get there, but not enough leadership on the anyway. So. But yes, very, very valuable indeed. Yeah.
Thanks. John, over to you.
Thanks, Marion. Thank you, Sandy, for I have a bit of a soft spot for broad historical sweeps, and thank you for that. As you were speaking, I was wondering what was going on the parallel track that of the United Nations. What was that institution and its various bodies doing that could be sort of like cross connections on the rails? So are there cross connections between the developments you're describing and what might be going on internationally through something like the UN?
Look, I think there were. We weren't close to it at the time, I'd have to say, but I think the sense of international development goals set by people whose needs drive the agenda.
Right.
I think that was fairly significant. And after that, I'd have to say it was trying to keep peace in the world, largely failing, but nevertheless trying. And, so those were the two things that I can vaguely remember from the time, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Robbie, are you asking a question?
If I could, Marion.
Yeah.
I think I'd just like Sandy to tease you a bit out more on the theology, because I see so much in the church today that remains in what I would call fantasy land. That is, things like going to heaven after you die, belief in miracles, belief in the Bible as literal history, where it's unscientific, and it just grates really badly with people who've grown up in a rational secular world. And so the ability of the ASCM to, I suppose, respect some of the emotional comfort that comes from that traditional concept of faith, while at the same time having a transformational and messianic vision of the whole purpose of faith, seems to be a problem that even the liberation theology movement is still struggling with.
Thanks, Robbie. I think it's a good question, and my answer is partly that it is still a matter for dialogue, because these aren't really narrable. It is a matter for listening better and for teasing out what's true in the other position. What's true in the more conservative position is partly, as you say, the comfort of it. I think it's also a kind of fantasy land's probably not a wrong description in a way, because it is a statement of what it would be like if God was loving and just in the way that we say that God is, so it's a hope rather than the truth. Unfortunately, they treat it as if it was a revealed truth, rather than something a little more nuanced and difficult. And also, I think the whole point about the dialogue is that the rational side of us needs some comfort with our emotional side. We need integration, and that's the aim of dialogue, I would say. So my book, The Burning Mirror, is an attempt to deal with mystical experience and to not to rationalize it exactly, but to bring it into conversation with our rational side. And I refer you to the book for details. But yes, I think you raise an important point, and it's really partly saying that when you talk about the world of the poor often are very confused at the theological level. God made an option for the poor made an option for the Pentecostals. Philly Carino was very ready to keep saying that, and what do we make of that? So you can't take your stand on any one thing in human journeying, I think, but you can stay afloat in faith. And the faith opens us to the Holy Spirit, which is what I would see as, holding us together in the dialogue. And that's not a comfortable position to be in, but I think it's a truthful one.
Can I pick up that point? Oh, Moya, were you going to say something?
No.
Yes, I can't find my chat button to put my hand up, but is there? I'd like, following on. My perspective has been from the Anglican Board of Mission perspective, and not from the. But it touches through to the World Council of Churches ideals. And did I understand you when you said, or were you questioning whether there were radicals in the church today? And I wanted to ask, how far is the church influenced by the culture around it? As I think in the 60s and 70s, the church was being influenced by the liberation movements in the Americas primarily, but in other, around the world. And is the church, do you think, today open to the challenge to look at itself? And what gives the church a confidence to be able to look at itself and to change?
Thank you for the question. And I think it's hard to generalize about the church, so say that up front. But what is important to me is more how we travel. How do we make progress? And when we are worried about any one culture influencing the church too much, let us not forget that the church is so deeply influenced by the culture that it's captive to it more often than not. The church is simply captive to what the broader culture does and says and believes, along with the Christian faith. So I've come to see the Christian faith as a kind of a yeast that is constantly turning over and challenging the assumptions of culture. And we need that, and we need to respect it, and I would say give it as much airspace as possible. So my answer is not a clear one in a way, because I'm simply saying it is a matter for the Holy Spirit to work with us in relation to our awareness of our own indebtedness and, I would say, subservience often to culture. And that's the first thing. The challenges from the other side of people who don't share our culture are very obvious. We can see culture in the other, we can't see it in ourselves. And I just think we need to be much better at seeing it in ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ian's got another question, and David has one, and I have some. I think we'll go David first. David, what do you want to say?
Thank you, Sandy. That really was a very helpful journey back through a very tumultuous period in the life of the church, and certainly in the life of the SCM. My question is really, how adequate do you think talking about who is oppressed, how adequate is that as a way forward? I remember one World Council of Churches meeting I was at, for example, and we were talking as usual about who was oppressed and who needed to be liberated and so on. And one of the participants stood up and said, I am 3 times oppressed. She said, I am a woman, I am Black, and I am a lay-person in the life of the church. Okay, she had 3 good points there. What she failed to mention, however, was that she was also a citizen of the United States. And compared to just about everyone else in the room, she was wealthy.
Yeah.
And if I bear that in mind in some of the other discussions I've heard about who is oppressed and who isn't, and who is the oppressor and who is not, there's so much oversimplification in the whole debate, and I keep wanting to say, look, the human condition is a damn sight more complicated, and in fact, human sin is a damn sight more subtle than this sort of classification really allows for.
Yes.
Is my reaction well-founded, or am I failing to see the point?
I think I would have great sympathy with your reaction. I think that claiming oppression in the abstract is always difficult, because injustice is particular, but it's also systemic. So if you're talking about particular injustice, then that can go to a court. If you're talking about systemic injustice, it's a matter for awareness of the culture and the disadvantages created, and how do you measure that? And it's various. It's very various. So one person's oppression is somebody else's opportunity. Often, you know, we shouldn't assume that the slaves in New Testament times were all of a piece, and many of them would have been very happy to be slaves of particular masters at that time. Who knows, you know? So I just don't think it's a reliable basis for certainly theologizing or agenda setting. I think it's a grist to the conversation more than a fundamental matter. That's where I came down. But being aware of oppression and being aware of what damage is done through oppression, that's a different matter. I think we all need that. And you hear that better you know, from the actual story as to, you know, what damage has been done. But don't use it to build.
I would like to jump in and pick up some of the points that came up a few questions ago, which was about the theological turn of the 1960s. Sandy, you were sort of, if I understood you rightly, you were attributing the drop-off in SCM's numerousness from 400 people at a conference down to 100, partly to the honest to God debate and the demythologization movement and all that kind of thing, which is also the story that we hear from conservative theologians like Alistair McGrath, and also from conservative sociologists of religion like the Public Choice School. But I wonder, so is that the case, that we just have to sort of accept that a questioning approach to theology alienates people, and what people want is a more supernaturalist kind of theology, which is what those people say, and that's what's going to get the numbers? You also mentioned the sort of turn away from liberation theology in South America, and you said, I like that slogan, God made an option for the poor and the poor made an option for the Pentecostals. But is that really what happened? I mean, a lot of analysis of what happened in South America is that liberation theology is a successful framework for people who are living either in a village community or working on the factory floor and organising collectively through trade unions. But what's happened now is that people have a very kind of the neoliberal revolution has meant that neither of those modes of life works anymore, and people are working as individual contractors, and Pentecostalism is the religious movement par excellence for neoliberalism. So to what extent is it a matter of intellectual shifts, and to what extent is it a matter of sociological shifts or economic shifts? That's my question.
Look, I think it's certainly both, and it's wrong to say that it's purely theological the theological one is easily misunderstood anyway. So it just seems to me it's too hard to generalize. But the question of, I would say, comfort with a conservative ideology is a cultural matter, and some people like it and some people don't. You know, that the comfort has always disquieted me. You know, too much comfort with our ideological position seems to me that we're missing something, and it's the voices from other experience which challenges that well, and puts us back in I would say, into the dialogue situation. So that's my personal response to the question. How that worked in Australia it's partly just organisational choices and changes in the university. That we've got I would say, a dumbing down of individual exploration at universities, which is quite noteworthy. And so SCM's always been trying to open up the questions on the edge that have priority. So, as I say, I really find it very hard to generalise about the actual numbers decline as to causes. I think there are many causes, and individual bits are true in some places, not in others. So it's not that I've got an answer to it. I'm just saying that what happened to the SCM is that we took on these challenges, and that the churches have already are now experiencing what we experienced in the 60s and 70s, very largely. So the comfort argument, I think, is not the well, there's a good thing about comfort. You know, we need to accept that God comforts us, that it is part of the faith that God does in fact love us and work with us and challenge us where needed, but also comfort us when we need comfort. And that comes in many forms. So it's not that there's any one particular virtue in a comfortable theology, but it's extending the comfort across everything else so that you become arrogant. Not good. That's about the best I can offer you, I think.
Thanks, Sandy. We have a hand up from Robbie, and I realise we're just coming up to 6 o'clock. So we shouldn't take up too much of Sandy's evening. Oh, we have another hand up from Helen. Okay, so I think that we should make these the last 2 comments, and Ian. Okay, we'll make those the last 3, and then we'll knock off.
Thanks,
So
Mary.
Robbie.
Look, this problem of Pentecostalism as a more successful form of Christianity, this argument that Christianity just needs to become more supernatural to get bums on seats, like it reflects the gulf that there is between that sort of faith and the modern world. Because, people in a secular, rational, scientific perspective view that sort of stuff with contempt. And so it's just so you can understand that like the SCM is occupying an in-between space. It's a space where we're saying that we want to be rational and scientific, but we also want to value what faith has to bring. And my sense is that sort of conservative Christianity is really deeply unbiblical. There's just so much in the Bible that supports a message of liberation and supports a messianic call for the transformation of the world. But that's just left out of that. Like Pentecostalism is about providing personal comfort. So I think, wrestling with those theological dilemmas is really important, and it's more important, I think, in Robinson's terms, to be honest to God, to be honest to the world as well.
Yes. No, full agreement, Robbie. I just think inhabiting the in-between space is the ecumenical space. And I spent time trying to get dialogue going with Pentecostal people. Not very successful, but often they're very good people. They're just sort of limited in their, deeply acculturated is part of it. That's really why I like Bible study. It takes you back to something that can challenge everybody, whichever end of the church we're on. So, but yes, I just agreeing with your question pretty much.
Thanks. Helen.
I was just going to make a brief comment on this whole, I know this debate was going on for a long time about why did the ASCM decline in the, well, whenever it did decline. And I think one of the things was the church, and I blame the whole church here, not just the ASCM, failed to recognise the implications of the Dawkins revolution on higher education.
Yes. Yeah.
Because even when I was teaching at Victoria University, I went to one meeting which the Uniting Church had with university lecturers, and would you believe they talked about the university, as if there's only one university in every city and there isn't diversity of types of higher education. We struggled at Victoria University to get the local churches to help get SCM, and a lot of the students were very interested in SCM type Christianity, but did not encounter it, which is why you've got something like the Progressive Christian Network in Victoria of all these people who've suddenly discovered, things that SCM knew 20 or 30 years ago. And something has gone, something about the way the ecumenical movement organised itself in Victoria and probably New South Wales. Maybe things are better in Queensland and Western Australia. I don't know, but it seemed to me a lot of people who were like the SCM members missed out sadly in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
End of story.
Can't fault your observations, Helen. Thank you.
Ian.
Yes, just really more an announcement. 2 hours before this session, I had a call from Meg Wardlaw, Harry Wardlaw's daughter, and they are packing up most of Harry's collection of books, which is enormous, and will be bringing it to my place. My place already has about 14,000 books in it, and it's going to burst at the seams. If anyone wants a book that possibly will have Harry's signature in it or something, please contact me, and I'd be willing to make books available to other places. I'll try and get some into libraries as well. Later, early next year, a series of lectures that began with Wes Campbell and Brian Howe and myself about religion in the university has been going on. And in the coming year, for the first time, the teaching staff of Islamic studies and Jewish studies are joining with us in those lectures. And I think that there are so many important ways we can also learn by working and talking with other faith communities.
Thank you, Ian. Sounds good.
Thanks very much for that. Michael, I noticed you had a comment in the chat. Do you want to expand on that at all?
No, it's all right. I guess I'm intrigued as an SCMer of the 80s, of which some of us are, that we came in with this drive that SCM was all about social justice, and that's a good thing. But I guess I'm intrigued by the death of God idea, which we were comfortable with in some senses. We were driven. our involvement of ASCM was really driven by a desire to achieve a better world together as Christians. And we were willing to do that together with, and in my case, my comment was, Marion and I attended the WSCF Human Resources Development Program, and it was focused on marginalized people. So we were, as Australian SCM, as the New Zealand SCM, we were driven by the desire that we needed to bring our marginalized people into the room. They weren't necessarily a Christian. I think maybe one of them too may have had some Christian beliefs, but they were there to represent the marginalized peoples, and that was a good thing. So I'm not sure what the question is. That's the problem. I've kind of, you know, I kind of, here I am, probably not very much a practicing Christian anymore, but I'm still so driven by what SCM stands for. And SCM stands for more than just, you know, there's something that drives us to be so involved in SCM that is beyond God. I mean, no, that's the wrong thing to say. It's I don't know, there's a real sense that we recognize that the church is in history has a lot to be accounted for, and we're all involved because we want to make the world a better place.
Thanks, Michael. That's really good to hear. And even back in the 50s, we were talking about the God beyond God, because the idea of God that we carried was such a Constantinian limited being, somehow caught up in our politics even, and just not believable. But God is not like that, really, and that's where the calling comes from, in my understanding. Also, I'd just like to say hello to Sue Parks. Welcome, Sue. Good to see you.
Well, look, we usually try to keep these discussions to an hour, and we've gone a bit over. Thank you, everybody, for such a stimulating discussion, and thank you so much, Sandy, for taking us back in time and telling us so much that we need to know about. We usually, regularly wind up with prayer. Mandy, can you do that for us?
Yes. Loving God, you are beyond everything we think we know. Thank you for that. And we pray that we will be able to be your loving people in the world, that we will be open to hear when people are hurting and to do. Thank you for the gift of the Australian Student Christian Movement and the World Student Christian Federation. Help us to be a blessing in our church, in our communities, in our world. We ask these things through the name of Jesus, who walks with us. Amen.
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 Thank you, Amen. Thank you, everyone. I've really appreciated the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Marion, could we mention that we're having another Zoom on in early November, the first Sunday, I think it's the 7th, Michael, isn't it? And right. We'll be talking with Carolyn Tan, who was an SCMer in the late 80s, and she is a native title lawyer in Western Australia and very involved in the Anglican Church over there. So she's an ASCM Senior Friend and obviously living the faith in her own way, but we thought she'd have some interesting perspectives. So hope to see you all then.
Thank you.
And thanks, Sandy.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you, Sandy.
Mandy, could I just ask now, did somebody say there's going to be, or is it already over, a celebration of the life of Peter Fensham?
Yes, there is, I think, but over to Sandy and Robbie to talk about that, Helen. And I must say, I didn't know Harry Wardlaw had passed on either, and he's been a major figure too.
Yes, indeed.
So,
look, unfortunately, the SCM Friends email list. No. no longer informs people about these things anymore. It's folded.